Teaching with the Smithsonian. Montgomery College videos are a collection of interviews with Montgomery College Smithsonian faculty fellows, sharing how they engage and empower students while exploring the complex challenges of the 21st century, such as climate change, social justice, and pandemics. Fellows offer concrete examples of how to work remotely with the Smithsonian, artifacts, and resources. Their work is adaptable for high school and college audiences. Be sure to visit their linked resources.
My name is Jamie Gillan. I'm a professor at Montgomery College, Rockville campus in the English department. I teach courses that are on research writing, introduction to college writing. I also teach literature courses, everything ranging from mythology to introduction to literature and more. I've been here for 10 years, and I also lead our digital storytelling internship along with my colleague, Matthew Decker. I've had the pleasure of teaching with museums and museum content for a number of years now. One of the most exciting things that's happened as a result of teaching with museums has actually occurred during the pandemic. What I've discovered is that the in-person museum experience is one thing entirely, and the virtual museum experience is a whole nother type of experience that yields different outcomes and really inspires students in a variety of ways. And I really think both are useful, helpful, and meaningful in the classroom setting. While I've had the opportunity to teach a number of different courses, in fact, I actually use museums and museum learning in each of my classes every semester, I'm going to highlight a particular experience that I've had with museums and museum learning. One project that has stood out over time, and I've had the opportunity to do this project for several years, is a project in an introduction to writing class. In that class, we begin with narrative, and then we move into things that are beyond personal narrative and move towards college level and research writing. So in the middle of that course, which is themed on food identity, we take a trip. Sometimes this is live and in person, and recently during the pandemic, it's been virtual. We take a trip first to the American History Museum, and we visit the food exhibit called Transforming the American Table. And I have students physically or virtually check out all of the different resources there. And then we move from there and head to African American history and culture, where we go to the cafe and we look at the menu items as well as the cafe itself and look at the photos on the walls and the quotes that are present there, and talk about the way in which food brings people, brings cultures and identities together. From this experience, students are encouraged first to write a narrative, and then they tie their experience that day to something that has happened in their own lives, and then they tie that to something that is larger, some larger context happening in America or in their community, something that we all might care about, a challenge that we face. After students share their experience at the museum, tying to one particular object or group of objects, and share how that impacted them, and tie that to how that is relevant to a larger context, American context, community context, world context. Students are then prompted to write a script, which later becomes a digital story. And the process of writing the script, editing the script, creating the content, the images that will go into their digital story narrative later, all of this yields some really incredible results for the individual student, as well as the collective identity of the group or the class. And one thing that I've seen over time is that this is a project that reaches all students. It challenges them to think very critically about how what they experience, how they connect to an object, how that might be significant and meaningful to a much larger, broader audience. One of my students' experiences is after visiting the museums, his object, the piece that he really connected to, was the Green Book. And this is the book that listed hotels, restaurants, and other establishments that were friendly to Black Americans or Blacks traveling in the South. And this student was not only inspired by the Green Book, but inside of the Green Book, he found his great-great-grandparents' hotel in Mississippi listed. So it was an incredibly personal connection to this particular object. And then he used his experience with that to relay some of his memories with family members in Mississippi and other places in the South. And he also used that object to talk about how we're still dealing with many of the same issues that his great-great-grandparents endured, and to talk about a call to action for civil rights, for Black Lives Matter, and other groups that are fighting for equity and equality in today's world. Another student story that I'd really like to share that came out of this food identity project found her voice specifically as a woman in our world. And she was really inspired. We had a change of events when we went downtown. It turned out in the pandemic time, American history was closed, and instead we went over to the Arts and Industries building. And in that exhibit, during that time, it was International Women's Month. And at that time, there were 3D orange printouts of different women leaders, especially in STEM. And she was just really inspired by all of these different leaders, all of these different women who are making an impact, making a difference in the world. This student grew up in a home where women were not valued. Their place was only in the home with the children, and specifically in the kitchen. And she talks in her final product about how she imagined that her office would be the kitchen, and has some great footage of herself cooking in the kitchen. As a result of going to the museums, of having this experience and seeing examples of many women in leadership roles, in STEM roles, in community organizations, she discovered that women really are as able and as capable of being valued by society and making contributions. And so for her, it was a life-altering experience to be part of the Smithsonian Museum coursework and to personally pursue something unique and to find her own voice. One of the results of teaching with museums and having students create digital stories from their experiences with museums, one of the outcomes that I've found is that students improve their writing skills. And as an English teacher, that's particularly important. It's essential to what they're learning in my classroom. And they are able to take those experiences to learn how to add concrete details, how to have concise language, and a lot of other attributes of writing that we value in the English discipline. One course where I've consistently utilized museum visits in person and virtually, and museum objects to teach is a course that's based on how to become a research writer, an argumentative research writer. And over time, this course has been themed on immigration as well as on social justice. In conjunction with writing a researched argument paper of the students choosing either targeted to a social justice theme or an immigration-specific theme, students go to the museum looking for artifacts and objects that they could utilize in their final product. Students in this course produce a 10-page, minimum of 10 sources final paper. It's a really big ask. And I approach this work by having students scaffold research, writing, and research sources over the course of the semester to hone their abilities to become researchers that can utilize library sources, internet sources ethically and responsibly, but also primary sources like museums to inform the work that they're doing that will hopefully make a difference in their personal lives, their academic lives, and perhaps in their communities and beyond. Over time, we have visited with students the National Portrait Gallery, African American History and Culture, the American History Museum, and others. In the National Portrait Gallery, there hangs a very large-scale piece called Chimamora Crossing the Delaware. This piece really speaks to the immigrant experience, especially when coming across the Pacific. Chimamora Crossing the Delaware is a reimagining of Washington crossing the Delaware, but instead of crossing the Delaware River, it's crossing the Pacific Ocean to emigrate to the United States. And this piece has shown students over time that the experiences of immigrants coming to this nation has been vast, has been diverse, and it's ongoing, that this experience is still happening again and again. And when a piece like that is paired alongside experience at the American History Museum, going to the Many Voices One Nation exhibit, where students can investigate any point in our nation's history and look at how communities have been formed, how people have traveled here over time, and in some cases, how they're treated when they get here, or the customs that they bring with them, or the integration of cultures that they experience. Anything from refugee soccer teams to how birthdays are celebrated, to crossing the southern border with Mexico and looking at objects people have actually brought across the border. At Montgomery College, so many of our students come from immigrant families or have an international experience, or their grandparents, their parents came here, and sometimes themselves, and they recognize these objects, the toothbrush that was brought across the border, or the other one piece of memorabilia. And oftentimes, this helps them connect this singular experience that this person in the museum had, or they themselves have had, with the larger experience of what does it mean to be an immigrant. And it can help students to take a primary source found at the museum and integrate that into their research writing. And time and again, this particular strategy has proven effective and innovative, and it brings students together. It gives them meaning and depth to the research that they're doing. For this academic course, it really grounds their learning in experience, and that is always a joy to watch. Recently, Hung Lu's portraits have been in the National Portrait Gallery, an entire collection. And students of mine in this most recent semester, spring 2022, had the opportunity to either visit those portraits in person or to virtually experience them online, and to see the lived experience that she shares of the everyday person, the everyday immigrant in both this country and in her home country of China. Students were able to watch online as Hung Lu tells some stories of her different portraits. They were able to read more about each one, or zoom in and see particular aspects that they were interested in by the museum piece. Or if they were there in person, they were able to walk up to the portrait and look very closely at what are oftentimes very large pieces. One particular piece of hers made it into several different students' research projects. And this was a parody of a fortune cookie where it's her immigration card and her name is Fortune Cookie. And it just really showcased for students in particular how immigrants' experiences are so stereotyped. And so many of them brought that particular image and what it speaks to around immigration for the current American society, how immigrants are treated, how they often feel like they're disappeared or that they don't fit or don't belong. And that really resonated with many students as they were writing, as they were talking and collaborating in class. And the experience as a whole served to connect these different class members, whether they chose to go with me in person, on their own in person, or experience the exhibit virtually. It gave us all this common experience and common language to be able to share. One of my very favorite courses to teach is Introduction to Literature. I love teaching this class, in part because it gives me space to inspire students to read more, to discover more, to consider different modalities as worthy of attention and research and learning and just taking it all in together. I often take students in Introduction to Literature to the National Portrait Gallery. We go other places too, but the National Portrait Gallery, their online services and the in-person experience always holds something special for students who are students of literature. One portrait in particular that has consistently been a fan favorite is the portrait of Toni Morrison. And this portrait looks more like a photograph than a portrait, but it's this really stoic and fierce portrait of Morrison, where she's in a gray sweater and her look is like that she is in command of her self and of her audience, and she is steely to the world and tough. And time over time, this portrait has resonated with new students of literature, regardless of their background or why they're taking the class at all. This portrait has spoken to them and it has inspired many students. Students often connect Morrison's portrait to their own lived experiences or the experiences that they see of the characters in the poem, the character in the novel or short story that we might be reading, or in the play that we might be experiencing. They see that need to be fierce, that need to be steely and ready, prepared for the world. It invites them to perhaps create their own image, their own character that will also resonate with the reader, the viewer, in the same way that her portrait resonates. I've seen many different student presentations that include her portrait as an example or a connection to some other literature character. In my Introduction to Literature course, one aspect that has been a lot of fun over the last several years is talking about music as poetry, music as literature. To that end, we sometimes use resources from the Folk Life Center about musicians and the work that they do and how it has changed culture or even the course of history. Protest music can feature prominently as a method, a vehicle for social change and action, which is relevant today just as much as it has been in the past decades. When students are looking at music as poetry, checking out the lyrics, they start to discover, oh, this music really can change the way people are thinking or gives an outlet to people who have been marginalized or oppressed, gives them a way to express themselves, to express the circumstances that they're within. In discussing music as poetry and music as protest literature, we had the chance in one of my recent Introduction to Literature courses to investigate the band Quetzal. And the reason that we had that chance was through the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. They have a learning lab collection about the band Quetzal and all of the work that they have done, both musically and in protest and in talking about issues between the border with Mexico, particularly in the California area and just across the border in Mexico, and how these cultures are colliding and in some cases clashing, but also about what the experience is like for humans coming across the border right now, what their experiences are like as they immigrate into the United States and become part of our society. Quetzal's music really highlights that. And the Learning Lab collection was a great way for students to latch onto that and to understand the way in which protest music is an effective tool of communication. And the Learning Lab collection also brought in history so that the context could be understood, as well as some biography pieces of the band members and their lead singer, who is really, really influential. This really sparked conversation within my class, and people really latched on to the energy that Quetzal's music brought to our classroom. And they really started to gel as a group. They were able to engage in dialogue that was critical in nature, dialogue where not everybody agreed, but they were able to do so in a civil manner, in a way that they respected and listened to the other people and to their perspectives and opinions. One of my students from that class was so inspired that in his music, he decided to go further and he applied to Berklee School of Music. And he hopes to one day be one of those musicians that contributes to social change and social good in order to, through his music, through producing protest music and being an activist. And that moment, learning about Quetzal, that was the spark for him to realize that his passion for social activism and social change could be connected and combined with his passion for music. And so that really was just a wonderful student experience and student outcome for him specifically and my class as a whole, and for me as an educator. In addition to the skills that students gained that are very academic skills, improving writing and other academic skills, there are some other work and real-world skills that I have seen transpire among students. For example, students learn as a result of their experiences to have critical dialogue across difference. One of the issues that we're facing in our communities, in our nation, and across the globe is the ability to have conversations that are with people who think very differently, and to really listen to the other perspective and not just simply be waiting to respond with our own thoughts, but rather to listen and respond to what they're saying. And students learn as a result of seeing many different perspectives at the physical and virtual museums to have those dialogues, those conversations, and to engage with one another when they think differently or see differently the different museum objects. One skill that I think is very important, regardless of discipline, that students gain when they participate in virtual and physical museum experience is that they hone their way of looking, their way of seeing. In looking at an object or a group of objects very closely, whether they're physically close or simply spending a long time with an object, really understanding the context, the detail, looking at it from multiple angles and perspectives, they are gaining a new way of looking, a new way of seeing. And that can be a transferable skill when they go out into their jobs and they are looking at a client problem, or if they enter a public-facing position when they're looking at and interacting with people. They might have a new way of looking at the circumstance, looking at the human in front of them, and considering the needs and answering the questions that are posed to them. This is a really important skill moving forward in our world, and learning with museums can be a way to contribute to that. The Smithsonian Learning Lab has been a game changer when it comes to students learning with museums. And us as educators, also the way that we approach learning with museums has been transformed by the availability of the Learning Lab. It used to be that I took students to the museum and then we came back and there wasn't a lot of discussion before we went or investigation of the sources that were available before or after. And now that we have the Learning Lab, I can use it in a variety of ways in my classrooms. I can have students build their own collections, which I often do, to represent their experiences or some other aspect of the class that has something to do with our actual museum visit. The Learning Lab also allows me as an educator to build my own collection if I want students to view something in particular, or I can have students work together and to share the things that they find interesting and relevant with their peers. And in many cases, I don't even necessarily have to be involved in that. I can be listening to them and what their experiences are with the different objects, what resonates with them, what inspires them, what makes them curious about learning about a particular area of knowledge. It's always a lot of fun to hear and see what they find, because it's often very different than what I might curate for them. And so the Learning Lab has given us an awesome pathway into museums and out of museums for us to collect our thoughts or to use those resources completely separate from learning with the physical object in the museum. And so I think that the Learning Lab has a variety of educational applications, and I'm still experimenting, and it's still getting better, so it's a lot of fun. One of the most exciting parts of teaching with museums, with both their virtual resources and the in-person resources, is the interdisciplinarity of it all. And students are able to see very clearly how one discipline connects to another discipline and yet to another and another. And this is a real value because in their future lives as contributing members of society, things do connect. They don't exist in silos. Things are all interdisciplinary, all interconnected. And museums are a space that allow us as learners, as individuals, to see how interconnected they really are. Truly, one of the best things about teaching with museums is the experience of taking students to the museum together. And it's this really joyful and magical moment when I'm able to personally connect with students, but also to watch them connect to one another and have conversations about this thing over here and this thing over here. And hey, come look at this. Those are really special experiences that are very hard to recreate in other spaces. It gives them a shared lived experience to discuss, to talk about. And then I really thought in the middle of the pandemic, we were going to lose that entirely with the need to be virtual only. And what I found is that even though they were doing the virtual visit at their home alone in most cases as a necessity of pandemic life, they still had this shared experience. They were going to this exhibit virtually together and this exhibit, and then they would come back to class and talk about it. And as they were writing their project or creating their digital story or whatever the piece was for that particular class, they had the opportunity to talk about like, oh, did you see that? Or, oh yeah, I saw that. This is what I think about it. And what did you think? And what did you discover? And that cross sharing of resources. Hey, I found this. I think it might be relevant to your research project, or this is really interesting and I thought you might enjoy seeing it. All of that really serves to bring community to our class, to allow course members who sometimes kind of sit on the edge or are not as engaged to step in and feel connected to and a sense of belonging with the other members of the classroom. And so that alone will continue to motivate me to teach with museums physically and virtually. I know many of the folks who are watching this educational series don't have the opportunity to bring their students to Washington, D.C., to the physical museum spaces. And I want to encourage wherever you are to find your local museum, your city museums, and take students to the physical space or to their virtual space. And you can have some of these same experiences that I have been talking about. It's possible to connect students to one another, to the objects that are present, regardless of the museum, for them to have shared space and shared learning experiences together. Another way that you can connect your local museum, wherever it is, whatever it looks like, whether it's large, small, indoor, outdoor, learning can be had. And one way to connect it is that you can use the Learning Lab in conjunction with the local entity, the local museum, their educational staff, the resources that they house. Take the Learning Lab, use it for all of the magnificent millions of resources that the Smithsonian has, and use that to connect to the local museums. Upload some content from your local space and bring it alongside content available from the Smithsonian. And it can create such a unique experience for your students, for them, as they go through that learning process. Whatever you want them to see, you can now combine them really easily.
This video was produced by Montgomery College Television on behalf of MC's Paul Peck Humanities Institute and Smithsonian's Office of Educational Technology. It is a companion to the Smithsonian's X-Course, Teaching with the Smithsonian, addressing 21st century challenges in the community college classroom. Learn more about this course at edx.org. Faculty interviewed for these videos teach at Montgomery College, a community college in suburban Maryland, just a subway ride from the Smithsonian Museums on the National Mall. Our MC Smithsonian Faculty Fellowship has spurred more than 25,000 visits by students and their families since 1998. Find our other faculty video interviews at youtube.com/Montgomery College.